You smelled it before you saw it. That's what the soldiers always said afterward. The smell reached them on the wind, a quarter-mile out, a smell that didn't belong to any battlefield they had crossed in 3 years of war. It got into your clothes. It got into your throat. And once you understood what it was, you never forgot it. In April of 1945, American soldiers advancing through central Germany came upon a string of railroad boxcars sitting on a siding. Dozens of them. The doors were shut. From the outside, it could have been any freight train in any rail yard in Europe: coal, lumber, ammunition, the ordinary cargo of a country at war. It was not coal. Inside those sealed wooden cars were close to 2,000 human bodies. Men, women, and children. Prisoners who had been packed in, locked down, and left on the tracks to starve, to suffocate, to freeze. The Germans had been moving them from one camp to another, ahead of the advancing Allies, and somewhere along the line they had simply stopped and walked away. The local townspeople, living in their tidy houses barely a mile down the road, would later swear they had no idea. None at all. They hadn't factored in that the man whose army found this, a 60-year-old general with a famous temper and a hatred of cruelty that ran bone deep, did not believe them for a single second. This is the story of what George S. Patton found in those boxcars in the spring of 1945, and what he forced an entire German town to do about it. To understand what they walked into, you have to understand how fast they were moving. By the first week of April, 1945, George Patton's Third Army was no longer fighting a war so much as chasing the wreckage of one. The German lines had collapsed. Patton's armored columns, the 12 and X Corps, his main striking arms, were tearing across central Germany at a pace that stunned even their own commanders. Tanks rolling through Thuringia, crossing rivers, smashing roadblocks, swallowing whole towns before lunch. They had blazed a trail from the coast of France, through Belgium, and now deep into the heart of the Reich. These were not soft men. The soldiers of the Third Army had been in continuous combat since the summer of 1944. They had seen Normandy. They had frozen through the Battle of the Bulge. They had watched friends die in numbers that don't fit on a page. They thought, by April of 1945, that there was nothing left in this war that could shock them. They were wrong. Because Patton's army was about to drive straight into the center of the Nazi machine, not the front-line version they had been fighting, but the other one, the hidden one, the one built behind the lines, in the forests, away from the cameras, the system of camps. On April 4th, soldiers from the 89th Infantry Division and the 4th Armored Division overran a place near the town of Gotha, a subcamp. The advance units didn't even have a name for what they were looking at yet. They just knew that something was very, very wrong and that the smell was everywhere. And the boxcars. There were boxcars on the rail lines all through this region in those weeks, part of a frantic last-minute effort by the SS to move prisoners away from the front before the Americans arrived. Some of those trains made it. Many did not. The cars were sealed, the prisoners packed in beyond capacity, with no food, no water, no air. Days would pass on the tracks. By the time the Americans found them, the cargo had stopped being prisoners and started being evidence. Patton himself was still up at headquarters, directing the advance, when the first frantic reports started coming back from his forward units. Reports that didn't read like military dispatches at all. Reports that the hardened officers writing them clearly did not have the words for. Something near Gotha, something he needed to see with his own eyes. The train sat on a siding, the way trains do when they've been shunted aside and forgotten. A line of wooden freight cars, the standard German type, the same kind, stamped with the cheerful capacity markings on the side. Room for 40 men or 8 horses. The doors were bolted from the outside. When the American soldiers slid the first door open, the daylight fell into the car. And the men standing there, combat veterans, every one of them went silent. I am not going to describe the worst of it. The photographs exist in the National Archives for anyone who needs proof. What matters is the arithmetic. Across the cars on that line, investigators counted close to 2,000 bodies, 39 boxcars, by one army account. The people inside had not been shot. They had not been gassed. They had been loaded in, sealed up, and left. They died slowly of starvation, of thirst, of suffocation, packed so tightly that some of them died standing up, with no room to fall. These were prisoners the SS had been evacuating from the camp system ahead of Patton's advance. The plan, such as it was, had been to move them deeper into Germany, away from liberation. But the railways were bombed. The schedules collapsed. The guards, sensing the end, simply abandoned the trains where they stood and slipped away into civilian clothes. A soldier who was there described the moment of opening the cars in words that never left him. According to one account recorded afterward, he said simply, "We just stood there. Nobody spoke." That was the thing that haunted the men most in the years after. Not the noise of battle, the silence. The total, absolute silence of 2,000 people who had been left to die 1 mile from a town where the lights were on, the chimneys were smoking, and dinner was being cooked. 1 mile. Think about that distance. You could walk it in 20 minutes. The people in that town had to have known. The smell alone, and the soldiers a quarter-mile out had smelled it, made not knowing impossible. And word of all of this was now racing back to one man. The commander of the Third Army, who was about to come and stand on that siding himself, the 12th of April, 1945. 3 of the most powerful men in the Allied armies got into staff cars and drove to a place called Ohrdruf. Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, Omar Bradley, and George Patton. They had decided, Eisenhower had insisted on it, that they would not lead an army through this country and look away from what that army was finding. They would go. They would look. They would stand in it. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of the larger Buchenwald complex, and it had been overrun a week earlier. By the time the generals arrived, a survivor of the camp was waiting to guide them through it personally. And what that man showed them, step by step, broke something in each of them. There were bodies in the yard, lying where they had fallen. There was a shed, and I'll leave the contents of the shed to your imagination, because the men who saw it could barely speak of it afterward. And there was a section of railroad track where the SS, in the panic of evacuation, had tried to burn the evidence. They had stacked bodies on the rails and set them alight. They had run out of time. What the generals found was the charred, half-finished proof of an attempt to make 2,000 murders simply disappear. Eisenhower walked through all of it on purpose. He forced himself to see every part of it. And he said something that day that has outlived him by 80 years. He explained that he was making himself a witness so that if the day ever came when someone stood up and called all of this propaganda a lie, an exaggeration, he would be able to say, from first-hand knowledge, that it was real. Now stop for a moment. Put yourself in that yard. You've fought across an entire continent. You think you've seen the worst that human beings can do to each other. And then a thin, dying man leads you by the hand to a shed and to a set of railroad tracks and shows you something that rearranges your understanding of what your enemy actually is. What would that do to you? For Patton, the loudest, hardest, most profane general in the United States Army, the answer came within 30 minutes, and it was not what anyone expected from old blood and guts. George Patton reached Ohrdruf at 3:30 in the afternoon. Understand who this man was. This was the general who told his troops to grease their tank treads with the guts of the enemy. The man who carried ivory-handled pistols and cursed like a stevedore, and bragged that he had never been afraid of anything in his life. He had built an entire public identity around being the toughest, most unshakable warrior America had. Old blood and guts. He lasted about 30 minutes. Robert Murphy, a senior diplomatic advisor to Eisenhower who was there that day, recorded what happened. According to Murphy's account, Patton went off to a corner thoroughly sick, the most famous fighting general in the U.S. Army walked behind a building and vomited against the wall. He physically could not keep it together in the presence of what the SS had built. And here is the part that tells you everything. Patton, who never apologized for anything, who turned his own brutality into a brand, was not ashamed of being sick that day. He understood the difference. There is a violence that belongs to soldiers, ugly as it is, and there is something else entirely. What he saw at Ohrdruf was the something else. It had nothing to do with war. It was the industrial murder of the helpless. He wrote to his wife Beatrice about it afterward. The letter survives. He told her that Ohrdruf was the first concentration camp any of them had seen, and that they had all prayed it would be the last. According to that letter, Patton wrote, "No such luck." 3 words. From the most verbose, theatrical commander in the army. No such luck. Because he already understood there would be more. Many more. That this was not an aberration, not one rogue camp, but a system, a vast machinery of death stretched across an entire nation that had told itself every single day that it knew nothing. If you've made it this far, you understand what this is really about. This was never just a war story. This was the moment a hardened soldier looked directly at organized evil and could not stomach it, literally could not. And what he chose to do next was aimed squarely at the people who had lived beside it and pretended not to see. Stay with me. Patton did not give a speech. He did not issue a press release. What he did was colder and far more effective. He turned to the question of the town. The tidy German town down the road and the dozens like it, scattered across this region where the citizens had gone about their lives 1 mile from the boxcars, 1 mile from the camps, breathing the same wind that carried that smell, and had decided collectively that they knew nothing. Patton did not believe them. Neither did Eisenhower. And the order that came down in the wake of those visits became a signature of the American advance through Germany. The civilians would not be allowed to look away. They would be made to see. In the town of Gotha, and again near Weimar by Buchenwald itself, American soldiers went house to house. The German citizens, the respectable ones, the ones who claimed innocence, were ordered to put on their good clothes, their Sunday best, and then they were marched, on foot, out to the camps, made to walk the rows, made to look at the bodies, made to stand at the edge of the mass graves and the burned railroad track and confront, with their own eyes, what had been happening in their own backyard while they baked bread and went to church. Patton ordered something else too. At Ohrdruf, every officer was instructed to leave the scene of the crime untouched, preserved exactly as found so that the proper investigators could document it. This was not vengeance for its own sake. He was building a record, evidence. He understood, even in his fury, that the most important weapon against this was proof that could never be denied. The effect on the German civilians was devastating. Many wept. Many were physically ill, just as Patton had been. And in at least one town near the camps, the mayor and his wife walked home after being forced to view what their neighbors had allowed, and that same night, the two of them took their own lives. The official reports tried to bury what happened next, the full scale of it, the towns, the forced marches, the things that didn't make the polished newsreels back home. But the photographs survived. The Army's own cameras rolled. Eisenhower made sure of it. He summoned congressmen and newspaper editors and flew them across the Atlantic for one reason, so that no one, ever, could say it didn't happen. The Germans had spent 12 years insisting they didn't see. Patton made them look. So what did it all add up to in the end? The evidence that Patton ordered preserved, and that Eisenhower demanded the world witness, did not stay buried in a German forest. It traveled. The photographs, the films, the sworn statements of the soldiers who opened those boxcars, they became part of the foundation of the case against the Nazi leadership at Nuremberg. When the architects of this system stood trial, they could not wave it away as wartime propaganda, because 3 generals had stood in it, because a survivor had led them by the hand through Ohrdruf, because congressmen and editors had been flown over to see the boxcars with their own eyes. The witnessing was the point. The witnessing was the weapon. In the years that followed, the United States Army formally recognized 36 of its divisions as liberating divisions units that had reached a Nazi camp within 48 hours of the first discovery. Patton's Third Army accounted for several of them. Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, the boxcars. Whatever else history says about George Patton, and it says plenty, both good and bad, this is on the record, permanently. His army tore open the doors the Nazis had bolted shut and refused to let the world look away. Patton himself had less than a year to live. He would die that December, in a car accident near Mannheim, in the country he had helped defeat. He never wrote a grand memoir about the camps. He didn't need to. 3 words in a letter to his wife said it all. No zooch luck. Here is what stays with me. The entire Nazi system depended on people not looking. The guards who walked away from the trains in civilian clothes. The townspeople who smelled it on the wind and said nothing. The whole machine ran on the willingness of ordinary people to keep their eyes down. And what Patton did, what Eisenhower did, was the exact opposite of that. They forced eyes open. They made looking mandatory. They turned witnessing into an act of justice. That's the lesson that outlived the war. Evil needs you to look away. Refusing to is where it starts to lose. Now I want to hand this over to you because so many of you watching had family who were there. If your father, your grandfather, Your great-uncles served in the European theater if they marched with the Third Army, if they were one of the men who opened those boxcars, if they helped liberate a camp and came home and could never quite talk about it. Leave their name in the comments below. Tell us their unit. Tell us what they saw or what they couldn't say. These men were witnesses to something the world was never supposed to find out about. They deserve to be remembered by more than a line in a record book. And the comment section under this video will outlast every history book ever written about this war. Their names belong here. Put them down.